Welcome back to yet another episode of SoundStage Take 2. My name is Jay and I will be your host again. And this is where I give you my second opinion as an end user, having spent time with the product that I love that has already been reviewed by a SoundStage reviewer. In this case, this one was reviewed by Doug Schneider on SoundStageHifi.com. And in this video, I'm not going to go into the details, the nitty-gritty stuff. Those things are on the written review, and you can find it at SoundStageHifi.com or in the description below. Now, strap your belts because this one is special. This one is a Canadian brand, and not only is it a Canadian brand based in Quebec, and you guessed it right, it's Simaudio. And that's right, they are one of the leading manufacturers in electronics, and we all have at some point hopefully owned or had heard the Simaudio stuff, and they're great stuff. Right? But this time around, they decided to make a speaker, which is quite a bold move. And not only is this a normal speaker, it's almost too normal. It is a two-way loudspeaker, a bookshelf or a stand mount loudspeaker, whatever you want to call it. At first glance, the speaker looks very, very normal, and they've called it the Moon Voice 22. Now, when they asked me to review this or give my second opinion on this product, my response wasn't all positive. In fact, I thought to myself, well, there is so many two-way loudspeakers that sound great. Sure, we've seen innovation where we've seen bookshelf speakers like, for example, the Bucard S400 that digs low into the bass region like a floor stander, which is great. But I just didn't think that this speaker looked any special or would sound anything special, bring something new to the table, if you so will, right? Well, was I wrong? The detail is what matters. I mean, let's admit it, a two-way loudspeaker is going to look like a two-way loudspeaker. There's nothing that has changed in the innovation and the design philosophy of making a good two-way loudspeaker. But there are things that can be done to make it a great two-way loudspeaker. And the Moon Voice 22 loudspeaker is certainly one of those speakers. For $3,000 US, which is already a very competitive market, mind you, this speaker has some stuff going for it. For example, the tweeter and the woofer is very close. Again, the details are what matters. They even cut out a little bit of that waveguide from the tweeter so that it is closer to the woofer, making it a more coherent sound. And sure, while the Moon Voice 22 is not a dual concentric design, they attempted to bring that tweeter very close to the woofer, which is a typical practice. It's nothing new. It's a typical practice of a very good two-way loudspeaker so that it's more coherent between the tweeter and the woofer. The sole purpose of this loudspeaker in the first place was to build a loudspeaker that would pair well with their electronics, more specifically what they call ACE, which was introduced about 5 years ago, retailing today about $4,200 US. Now, while I regretfully don't have the ACE in hand to test out how great it sounds with the ACE, which was what it was voiced with, I assume, I've tried with many other quality electronics, such as my humongous Denafrips Apollo amplifier, the Doge 10 Mark III tube integrated amplifier, line magnetic tube integrated amplifier, as well as some of the budget offerings like the Iota VX, SA3, and PA3 stack, as well as the Thalo from Denafrips again, which is one of my favorite amplifiers at that price point. So I've tried with various different quality gear, albeit not the ACE. And my verdict is that this is a very coherent loudspeaker, which is one of the beauties of a two-way loudspeaker design. And to achieve such coherency and such seamlessness, I found that this was their goal because you can see it even in the design. Again, details what matters. Another thing that I'll introduce to you is the bass. Now, not only does this bass work as a buffer between the speakers and the furniture so it doesn't damage anything. If you were intending to use this on a furniture, that's what the bass is for. But also, it allows it to be more isolated from the room, right? It's allowing it to be more isolated from the stand you're putting on. So it's more isolated. And it gives you this floating effect, not just physically, but sonically as well. It gives you a more kind of floating effect when it comes to the speaker itself. And remember, the ultimate goal is to fully isolate the gear and the speakers itself for the best possible, no interference sound profile that you're going for, which is technically impossible, but we see many manufacturers kind of attempt that. I think this is one of the best ways a two-way loudspeaker has attempted that. Because this bass is quality, mind you. It's not some cheap bass. You can feel that it's quality. And it has this rubbery material to it as well. Now, what you don't see is inside this cabinet, inside the walls. And this has this type of groove, and they have this almost a pattern for it, and they've applied for one because it's that unique. And they filled it with this kind of rubbery material. And you can see the pictures more in the actual review in the description below. But they've done this because they wanted to dampen the cabinet more for resonance control, and really, again, to isolate that speaker and make it sound pure as possible. And at the end of the day, what you get is a very natural sounding loudspeaker without much coloration going on. Now, it's pretty neutral and they don't do anything abnormal. And at first listen, you may think, oh gosh, it's a boring two-way loudspeaker. And that was my first impression as well. But after playing the speaker for weeks, I found that they are quite the keeper, a sleeper loudspeaker, if you so will, that doesn't do anything crazy to wow you at first listen, but over time you appreciate it because of its neutrality and because of how natural it sounds with all the music that you throw at it. The 6-inch woofer and the 1.1-inch soft dome tweeter is very standard, like in any loudspeaker. And doesn't do crazy things like hit the bass low like the Picard S400 or the PSP B600 Synchrony. Those are exceptions. These don't attempt to be a floor standard. But what they do is that they do dig lower than most two-way loudspeakers. They do that very well. It's not elevated in any way, but it's extending pretty low. I would say around 50 hertz in my room. And that's pretty impressive for a two-way loudspeaker. Now again, you're not going to be promised a crazy bass response that rivals floor standards. That's not what you get here. What you do get is very quality bass up to around 50-60 hertz in your room, which is plenty for a lot of the people out there listening to their music. And if you really wanted, you can even add a subwoofer, but that is if you really want that lower bass extension. Other than that, I found myself not using the subwoofer as much because I enjoy the overall presentation of this two-way loudspeaker by itself. In terms of the mid-range is again very neutral with a slight, just ever so slight bit of emphasis. Now it's not bright or in your face, but it is just smidge, heightened just a little bit to my ears to allow for a little bit of excitement and doesn't bore you, right? If it's too neutral, it may bore you. So I think they added a little bit of character there, but it's not too much character to where you first listen to it and you go like, oh yeah, definitely the mid-range is boosted. No, that's something you realize over a long listening session. And talking about long listening session, this speaker is extremely easy to listen to. It is very smooth in its response. It's very smooth in its presentation. So when you listen to music, it doesn't just shout at you all the information. It's detailed, it's nuanced, but it's laid back. And if you're a fan of like Focal speakers or even PSP speakers that's a little bit more articulate, you may find the speaker a little bit too laid back for your liking. But overall, it has all the details, all the nuance, but it's overall a little bit more laid back than the PSP or the Focals in my books, so that it's a little bit more easier to listen to for long periods of time. And I think that's an added benefit. And most importantly, adding to that, easy to listen to factor, I guess the high frequency is what is the most, allowing that. The high frequency is not rolled off, but at the same time, it's not, heightened either. The high frequency is extremely neutral. One of the most neutral high frequency I've heard in a two-way loudspeaker. I find it's like the perfect balance, and this actually allows for music that's not very well recorded to be played out of the speaker with exceptional, finesse. So it depends on what you're listening to. Because the speaker is so neutral in the high frequency, at least in my books and my, kind of guide here, when I play music that is a little bit more recorded with sibilance, then I get that, right? When it's not recorded as well, like modern music or even some of the older recordings that has a little bit of that sibilance going on, then I get that sibilance, but not to a degree where I would scream, oh no, pause that right now, because you get that with some loudspeakers, especially two-way loudspeakers that has a little bit of that V curve with impressive bass and impressive treble. So if you play this kind of track, not well recorded track on a speaker, on a two-way loudspeaker specifically, with that heightened high frequency response, then it's unlistenable, at least to me. But with this speaker, it's at that point where it's listenable, but it's still at times bright, right? With poor recordings. But with great recordings, you get that sense of neutrality. You get that sense of I don't like to use this word because you will never know. You will never know. But you get the sense that, or the illusion that you're hearing what the artist intended you to hear. So the main focus was definitely on the mid-range and high frequency on the speaker and the coherency between the tweeter and the woofer, and overall isolating the speaker as much as possible, doing the right things to make the two-way loudspeaker as good as possible without deviating too much from the norm, or trying to do any special things or special effects to make the speaker pop or give you a wow factor immediately, but something you can appreciate over a long period of time and long listening session. This speaker, I think, is here for the long haul. I think this speaker is here for you to listen to and appreciate and have ownership for a very long period of time. It is not a short relationship you will have with this speaker. You will have a long relationship with the speaker if you buy it. And I say this because it never bores you. It's kind of contradictory to what I said in terms of how neutral it sounds. It may sound a little bit boring, but it never bores you because whatever your gear is, it reflects it very well. I put the speaker on many different types of gear, and it shows what the gear is doing extremely well because of how neutral and natural the presentation is. And at no point did any gear sound bad with it. I had preferences like tube amplifiers with this because it gave you a more holographic soundstage, but that doesn't mean that was going to be it. If I wanted a little bit more bass emphasis or a little bit more that girth or earthy sound in the mid-range, then I could do that by pairing it with my Apollo powerhouse solid-state amplifier. So at no point was I bored. Now this is given that you like to switch out your gear and kind of appreciate the sound effects. But this is also true that you will never go wrong, in my opinion, with pairing with multiple different types of gear. And I think this is only a good thing because the number one question I get every time I review a speaker is, what sounds best with it? And I wish I could give you that answer, right? And often people go like, oh, I have this amplifier, will it sound good with the speaker you just reviewed? Well, I can only answer that if I heard it with that amplifier. But with all the experience I've had with multiple types of gear with the speaker, varying from Class A, Class AB, solid state, tube amplifier, Class D amplifier, it never sounded bad. In fact, it sounded great every single time, and it's bringing out the best of what you can hear from the gear. So it's quite good in that regard, and it's truly high-end in terms of that regard. So I'm happy about that because then the person who's buying it will never get a bad sound with the speaker. Now, in terms of imaging and sound staging, it's very standard. It's not the largest soundstage I've heard, but again, that coherency allows it for it to have great imaging. So you get pretty precise imaging without too much of the edges going on. And because of that little bit of that mid-range emphasis, that heightens the sense of space and allows the speaker to sound more open and not flat and neutral and too toned down to where you don't hear any of that kind of space cues. You hear all that, you hear that space, and you hear the soundstage and the imaging. It's just that even though imaging is a little bit above average in terms of its specific capability, I would say the sound staging is pretty average in terms of a two-way loudspeaker. What is really impressive about the speaker is really the coherency that it lends itself to because of the overall design and because they didn't try to do anything too crazy with the two-way loudspeaker. And again, that's an assumption, but I don't think it takes a genius to realize when you look at that speaker, they were trying to make a good two-way loudspeaker as great as they can within that budget without, doing anything too crazy or too wild to make it sound different. They're not trying to be different. They're trying to make it sound as good as possible for a two-way loudspeaker design. When placing these speakers, I really had no problems placing them. They sounded great towards the wall, out of the wall. Of course, I preferred it when it was out into the room a little bit more, about 3 to 4 feet, with a pretty heavy toe in for the speaker because I found that to really give me the most neutral sound in the high frequency. But if the high frequency is too much for you, for example, with poor recordings, you can toe it out, and to make it a little bit less fatiguing. I found that the speaker had great off-axis response, at least to my ears. Now, they do have a full NRC and anechoic, measurement done by SoundStage in the link description below for you to check out. But I haven't checked out that measurement myself just yet because it's my belief that if I looked at the measurements first and then listened to the speakers and then made my subjective assessment, then it will bias me consciously or unconsciously to agree with the measurements with what I heard and correlate it somehow, even though that's not exactly what I heard, subjectively speaking, in my listening room. So I'm personally excited to check out the measurements myself after this video is done, but I'm very happy to report that I think they made a great loudspeaker, and I hope they make more loudspeakers because I think this is a really great direction in how sound they have going for them. Because for people like my friend Tujin or my friends that don't like bright sounds and want something neutral that sounds coherent, I think they did a really great job here. And I will really want to see a three-way design and a full standard design of this speaker specifically because of how great the two-way loudspeaker is. And maybe this is kind of a segue to that. I don't know, but I really hope it is because I want to see more from Simaudio. So that's pretty much it. I think the Moon Voice 22 is a killer loudspeaker for their first loudspeaker attempt, and I hope they make more. I'll see you guys on the next one.